The avoidant attachment style operates on a fundamental contradiction that most people never recognize. They desperately want connection while simultaneously sabotaging every relationship that gets too close. They crave intimacy but panic when someone actually provides it. This internal war creates a predictable pattern that plays out in relationship after relationship, and understanding this pattern gives you unprecedented power over the dynamic. The avoidant person has built their entire identity around being self-sufficient, independent, and emotionally untouchable. Their ego is constructed on the belief that they don't need anyone, that relationships are optional luxuries rather than essential human connections. This facade of invulnerability becomes their prison, trapping them in cycles of push and pull that leave both parties exhausted and confused. When you first encounter an avoidant person, they seem like the perfect catch. They're charming, mysterious, accomplished, and refreshingly different from clingy, needy partners you might have experienced before. They give you just enough attention to keep you hooked while maintaining enough distance to keep you guessing. This calculated emotional availability triggers something primal in most people, the desire to be the one who finally breaks through their walls. But here's what's really happening beneath the surface. The avoidant person is constantly monitoring the relationship for signs of threat, not physical threat, but emotional threat. The moment they sense you're getting too attached, too comfortable, or too expectant of consistent emotional availability, their internal alarm system activates. They begin the deactivation process, subtly withdrawing, creating conflict, or simply disappearing without explanation. This withdrawal serves multiple purposes for the avoidant. First, it protects them from the vulnerability they're terrified of experiencing. Second, it maintains their sense of control and independence. Third, and most importantly for understanding this dynamic, it reinforces their ego's narrative that they don't actually need the relationship. Every time they successfully create distance, they prove to themselves that they're fine alone, that their self-sufficient identity remains intact. The typical response from most people when faced with avoidant withdrawal is to pursue harder. They text more frequently, offer more reassurance, become more accommodating, and essentially volunteer to do the emotional heavy lifting for both people in the relationship. This pursuit feels loving and committed, but it actually feeds directly into the avoidance ego structure. Your pursuit confirms their internal narrative that they're the prize, the one with power, the one who doesn't need to invest equally because you're already doing all the work. Every time you chase an avoidant who's withdrawing, you're essentially telling them that their strategy is working perfectly. You're proving that they can maintain emotional distance while still receiving the benefits of connection. You're reinforcing their belief that relationships are about power dynamics rather than mutual vulnerability and support. Most critically, you're strengthening the very ego structure that keeps them trapped in this pattern. The ego of an avoidant person is built on several core beliefs that must remain unchallenged for their defensive system to function. They believe they're more independent than other people. They believe they're less needy than other people. They believe they're more rational and less emotional than other people. They believe they have more options and alternatives than other people. They believe they're the one being pursued rather than the one doing the pursuing. Challenge any of these beliefs directly, and you'll trigger their defensive responses. But destroy these beliefs through your actions rather than your words, and something fascinating happens. When you stop pursuing an avoidant who's withdrawn, you're not just changing your behavior, you're attacking the foundation of their ego structure. Suddenly, they're not the prize being chased. They're not the independent one while you're the needy one. They're not the one with all the power in the dynamic. The shift doesn't happen immediately, and it doesn't happen without significant internal turmoil on their part. The initial phase of ego destruction looks like confusion. The avoidant person expects your pursuit. They've structured their withdrawal specifically to trigger your chasing behavior because that chase validates their ego and confirms their worldview. When you don't chase, when you don't text, when you don't try to fix things or win them back, they experience cognitive dissonance. Their actions didn't produce the expected results, which means either their strategy is flawed or their understanding of the dynamic is incorrect. Both possibilities threaten their ego structure. The second phase involves them testing your resolve. They might reach out with casual messages, create scenarios where you're likely to encounter them, or suddenly become active on social media in ways designed to capture your attention. These aren't genuine attempts at reconnection, they're ego preservation tactics. They're trying to reestablish the familiar dynamic where they withdraw and you pursue. If you respond to these tests with renewed pursuit, you've just reset the entire cycle and reinforced their ego more strongly than before. But if you remain consistent in your non-pursuit, if you respond to their tests with polite disinterest or don't respond at all, you move into the third phase of ego destruction. This is where their internal narrative begins to crumble. They start questioning whether they actually had the power they thought they had. They begin to wonder if maybe you weren't as invested as they assumed. They start to consider the possibility that they've lost something valuable rather than simply exercising their independence. The fourth phase is where the real psychological shift occurs. The avoidant person begins to experience what they've been running from all along: genuine vulnerability. Not the manufactured vulnerability they might have shared during love bombing phases, but the raw, uncomfortable recognition that they actually do need and want connection. Their ego structure, built on the foundation of not needing anyone, starts to collapse when faced with the reality that someone they valued has moved on without them. This collapse doesn't feel empowering or liberating initially. It feels terrifying. The avoidant person has spent years, often decades, building walls and defenses specifically to avoid this feeling. When those defenses fail, when their ego-based strategies stop working, they're forced to confront the deeper attachment needs they've been suppressing. This confrontation is what ultimately drives them to return. But here's the crucial distinction that most people miss. When an avoidant returns after their ego has been challenged, they're not returning from a position of strength or casual interest. They're returning from a position of genuine need. The person who once seemed to barely notice your absence is now actively missing your presence. The person who could take or leave the relationship is now recognizing its actual value. The person who positioned themselves as the prize is now recognizing that they might have lost something precious. This shift in their internal experience translates to dramatically different behavior when they do return. Instead of the half-hearted, commitment-phobic approach they demonstrated before, they often return with unusual directness and vulnerability. They might share feelings they've never expressed before. They might make commitments they previously avoided. They might demonstrate the kind of emotional availability that seemed impossible during the original relationship. However, this return comes with important caveats that you must understand to navigate it successfully. First, their ego hasn't been permanently destroyed, it's been temporarily destabilized. If you immediately return to old patterns of pursuit and accommodation, you'll quickly rebuild their ego structure and recreate the original dynamic. The window of their vulnerability is real but limited. Second, their return doesn't automatically indicate that they've done the deeper work necessary for a healthy relationship. Ego destruction can motivate change, but it doesn't automatically create change. They may genuinely feel differently about the relationship and about you, but feeling differently doesn't guarantee they have new skills or strategies for maintaining intimacy without reverting to old patterns. Third, you must be prepared for the possibility that their return is motivated more by ego repair than genuine relationship commitment. Some avoidant individuals return not because they've recognized the value of the connection, but because they need to reestablish their sense of power and control. They need to prove to themselves that they can still get you back, that their attractiveness and desirability remain intact. The key to distinguishing between genuine vulnerability and ego repair lies in their behavior during the return process. Genuine vulnerability shows up as increased emotional availability, willingness to discuss the previous problems in the relationship, acknowledgement of their own role in the relationship's difficulties, proactive efforts to demonstrate change rather than just promising it. Ego repair, by contrast, shows up as attempts to quickly return to the previous dynamic, reluctance to discuss what went wrong, focus on your behavior rather than their own, efforts to secure your commitment without offering equivalent commitment themselves. They want to reestablish their position of power without actually addressing the underlying issues that created the cycle in the first place. Understanding this distinction is crucial because your response in this moment determines whether you're entering a genuinely different relationship dynamic or simply starting another cycle of the same pattern. If you recognize genuine vulnerability, you have an opportunity to build something healthier. If you recognize ego repair, you need to maintain your boundaries and refuse to re-enter the old dynamic. The most important factor in determining which type of return you're experiencing is their willingness to acknowledge and take responsibility for the impact of their previous behavior. An avoidant person whose ego has been genuinely challenged will recognize that their withdrawal caused real harm and will demonstrate genuine remorse. They'll understand that trust needs to be rebuilt rather than simply resumed. An avoidant person who's primarily focused on ego repair will minimize the impact of their previous behavior, suggest that you're being too sensitive or holding grudges, push for an immediate return to intimacy without addressing the underlying issues. They want the benefits of your connection without accepting responsibility for the costs of their behavior. Your ability to maintain clear boundaries during their return process is what ultimately determines whether this experience leads to growth or simply repeats old patterns. This means being willing to say no to immediate intimacy until they've demonstrated consistent change, requiring actions rather than accepting words, maintaining your own independence and interests rather than dropping everything because they've finally returned. The destruction of their ego creates an opportunity, but it doesn't guarantee a different outcome. The opportunity exists because they're temporarily experiencing the vulnerability and need that they've been avoiding. But whether that temporary experience translates into lasting change depends largely on how you respond to their return and whether you're willing to maintain the boundaries that created their ego collapse in the first place. Most people make the mistake of immediately reverting to pursuit behavior the moment the avoidant shows renewed interest. They're so relieved and excited by the return that they abandon the very approach that made the return possible. This is understandable but counterproductive. The non-pursuit that destroyed their ego must continue even after they return, not as manipulation or game playing, but as a natural expression of your own independence and self-respect. When you maintain your boundaries and independence even as they're trying to return, you're communicating something crucial. You're demonstrating that your willingness to be in a relationship with them isn't based on desperation or need, but on genuine choice. You're showing them that their presence in your life is welcomed, but not required for your well-being. This continued challenge to their ego structure is what maintains their motivation to show up differently in the relationship. The ultimate goal isn't to keep their ego permanently destroyed. That would create an unhealthy power imbalance in the opposite direction. The goal is to help them recognize that healthy relationships require mutual vulnerability and investment. The ego destruction serves as a catalyst for this recognition, but the ongoing relationship must be built on more solid foundations than ego dynamics. Understanding this process gives you clarity about what's really happening in these complex relationship patterns. The avoidance return isn't about you being irresistible or special. It's about psychological principles playing out predictably. Their ego structure required your pursuit to maintain itself, and your withdrawal challenged that structure in ways that forced them to confront their genuine attachment needs. This understanding should make you neither cocky nor desperate. Instead, it should give you the confidence to maintain healthy boundaries and the wisdom to recognize genuine change when you see it. The avoidant will come back when their ego is challenged, but whether that return leads to something meaningful depends entirely on what you do next.